This week we're going to look at methods of gathering data for the emotional factor. The key aim of today's lesson is to identify two different methods of gathering data for the emotional factor. So we'll be looking at the POMS test, which is the profile of mood states, which is also another questionnaire, and we're also going to refer back to the performance profiling wheel. So success criteria is to be able to describe what each method looks like and what the protocols are, so how you actually carried that out, and to understand the benefits and limitations of each method, which will assist you in answering, explain, evaluate and analyse questions. Firstly, for the emotional factor, you're going to complete a profile of mood states, which is a questionnaire that contains 65 words or emotions that describe feelings that people have. So the test requires you to indicate for each word or statement how you have been feeling in the past week and including today. So how to conduct the test. So this is taken directly from the website. So for each statement, it's basically a list, and you're going to just basically decide how you've been feeling and don't overthink it in respect to the word in the statement. So you'll be asked to select either not at all, a little, moderately, quite a lot, or extremely to indicate how you're feeling. You've got 65 words or statements there, and there's no time limit on that. But as I said, just take your time with it, but don't overthink any of them. The assistant determines and records the athlete's mood state scores. So at the end, you'll be able to click Analyse and it will give you a score. Once you've now reached the end of the test, you click on the word Analyse, and on this slide here it tells you exactly what that's calculating, and it will give you a total score, which is known as your total mood disturbance score. After that, you'll have a mood profile which breaks it down into anger, confusion, depression, fatigue, tension and vigour, and you have a new score for each of these aspects as well. What I would ask you to do now is to write down what you see as perhaps your strength and also your area for development. As you can see here, I have flicked through the POMS test. I've selected just at random for the sake of these slides, and I've been able to generate a score of 99, and then there are also a breakdown there for each of the different mood profiles. For the first command word of describe, it is about the process that you went through and actually what the test consisted of. So what I have done here is I have simply bullet pointed. When you're constructing your own answer, I would discourage you from bullet pointing, but just these points here will help you to construct sentences. So saying that you completed it on your own, you were in a quiet place with no distractions, the fact that you accessed the POMS test online, and then what you do is you're kind of going down about what it actually looked like and the process you went through. So there were a list of 65 statements or emotions. You had the option to select between not at all, a little, moderately, quite a lot, or extremely to indicate your feeling. You then clicked Analyse, your scores were then calculated to get your total mood disturbance score, and you could then indicate what your score was. So for example, I scored 99 out of 200. I then access the mood profile, and then you can highlight the categories of the mood profile to help you access marks there. And then at the end, it's a good idea to then identify what your strength was from this and what your area for development was. In order for you to answer the other three command words, to explain, to evaluate and to analyse, it's important that we're able to highlight what the benefits and the limitations of the POMS test actually are. So what I'm going to ask you to do now in activity 1 is just using the chat on Teams. Can you please type in some benefits of the POMS test? Once you have finished that, can I ask you to now type in the limitations of this method? Now that you have completed this and had a bit of discussion with your class teacher, I have written down different answers that you may or may not have discussed and things that maybe popped up before. So, first and foremost, is it easy to understand? Perhaps you didn't really have to stop and go back and ask the teacher loads of questions. It was pretty straightforward. There was no time limit on it or anything, so no pressure there. Was it easy to interpret your results? Obviously, the computer was able to actually generate the results this time. You weren't required to calculate them. So that meant it was a little bit easier for you when actually calculating what your final score was. It provided you with baseline information to plan a PDP, so it gives you a number there to start with, and then you can say, right, I think these approaches will be most suitable for me in accordance to how I've scored. So it's going to help you plan a meaningful programme of work. It's going to help you with target setting. So again, simply if I scored 99 out of 200, your target might be to score, for example, 110 out of 200 at the end of the 6 weeks. It gives you a place to start with and then something to work towards. The score is calculated by the computer, so that takes away the chance of human error. So maybe adding the scores up on your own or using a calculator. The score is generated by the computer, which will increase the reliability of the results. It also identifies your strengths and weaknesses. So each aspect is broken down there, and you're able to say now that certain areas are your strength and certain areas are your weaknesses. And then again, that allows you to tailor the approaches that you're using within your programme of work. So those are a list of benefits. On the other hand, some limitations. So the performer, the person completing the POMS test may be dishonest. Perhaps that's more likely to happen if you're sitting next to a friend doing it. It could be quite rushed. There were a large number of statements on that as well. So perhaps by the time you got to the end, you felt a little bit bored and you just started clicking randomly and you weren't maybe thinking about it carefully. There is also the emotional state sitting at home may not be the same as playing it in a competitive game. So you're sitting in the comfort of your own home just now. Would that be the same if you were actually hyped up to go and play a game of netball or a game of football? Would you be feeling the same? Simply as well, it requires internet access, this test. It's not on a bit of paper, so do you have all this sort of technology that's involved? We didn't fully understand some of the terms used in the POMS test, and you may perhaps had to research them or ask the teacher throughout. And it also didn't necessarily tell us why something is a weakness. It just highlighted the words and that was a weakness, but it didn't really give you context. Is it before you go on to play a game? Is it during it? Is it after? It doesn't really tell you much about the reasons why. What you're going to look at now are considerations for successful completion of the POMS test. So, what kind of things would you recommend or consider? So, I want you to now put yourself almost in the teacher's shoes, and if you were to complete the test again or lead an athlete through this data collection process, what recommendations or considerations would you provide them with to ensure that they obtain the most accurate information possible? So perhaps things that you have done now and look back and thought, I shouldn't have done that because that's maybe decreased the validity of my results. So what I want you to do now is just pop some suggestions into the chat at the side. I have listed some considerations that you may or may not have spoken about, so please feel free to add on. So completing the test in a quiet space without any distractions. So it's important to ensure you're doing that. That can then link to the fact that you're maybe filling it out honestly or you weren't rushing it and so on, which takes me on to my next point. You need to ensure that you're allocating enough time to the process so that you're not just rushing through it. It didn't just take a minute to fill out, it took a good couple of minutes. Although you didn't have to necessarily generate the answers on your own, there were 65 different statements and emotions there, so it did take a little bit of time. So it's important to ensure that you do allocate yourself enough time to go through this process. It could be important as well to maybe ask a teacher or research the terms that you were unsure about, because there were perhaps a few emotions that you maybe hadn't heard of before, and it's important to understand what they actually mean before then recording an answer. Another thing that we have spoken about in the past is your technology. Is it up to scratch? So something that was in the benefits and limitations table is access to the internet, but it could also be as simple as having devices charged to ensure that the process goes smoothly and it doesn't cut out in the middle of the data collection process. Finally, personal circumstances when completing the test. So, will this test truly reflect on your emotions? So, has something happened? Maybe you didn't get the breakfast that you wanted and now you're in a bad mood and you're filling this test out. Maybe something's happened at home and you're maybe not in the best place to be making these decisions right now. Moving on to the performance profiling wheel, so this will start to become a little bit repetitive, which is good. You have completed this last week, so you'll be able to now start to develop a bank of model answers for this one. What I have done is I have pasted a performance profiling wheel for the emotional factor, and then down the side, what I'm just going to ask you to do, so you don't need to draw this or anything, is to just rate yourself out of 10. Now, this is a little bit more challenging because some of the phrases can be positive and some of them are negative. So, I would say, for example, that confidence is quite a positive attribute. However, maybe nerves is a little bit more negative. So, the way I've worded them, I've tried to be careful. So, what you need to see it as is colouring in from the inside out. So, if it's, for example, 10 out of 10, that's the best case scenario. So, if you're a 10 out of 10 for confidence, you are super confident. If you're a 10 out of 10 for lack of nerves, you're in complete control of your nerves. So the outer circle is essentially the best case scenario. So can you just now, in your jotters, just list each of the sub factors and rate yourself out of 10? In terms of describing the performance profiling wheel, again, this is something that you have looked at last week. So in your notebooks, can I ask you to write down the process that you have undertaken to complete the performance profiling wheel? So quite similar to the bullet points that I have used for the POMS test. So where did you complete this? Who did you complete it with? What did you actually do? What was the process? And what did you find out? So what did you score? What were your strengths and what were your areas for development? So can you just bullet point just now a list of descriptive points that you could use to assist you in a describe question? The next activity, again, similar to your POMS test, what I'm looking for you to do now is to outline the benefits and limitations, because as I've said before, this will assist you in your explain, evaluate and your analyse questions. So for your first activity, on the chat at the side, can you please type in some benefits of the performance profiling wheel? Once you have finished this, can I ask you to then complete the write down, the limitations of the performance profiling wheel on the chat. Again, please feel free to add on any that I've missed out, and you can copy this table down if there are any here that you haven't yet discussed. So again, easy to complete, not too difficult to understand. You didn't have to ask the teacher loads and loads of questions about how to do it. It was pretty straightforward. It's easy to interpret the results. It's very sort of visual, so you can see very clearly I scored 2 out of 10 for confidence, so it's clearly a weakness. So it provides you with that quantitative data and it's very easy to identify what your strengths and weaknesses are from that. Again, it provides you with baseline information to plan a PDP, so you know, for example, if your starting point is maybe about 2 out of 10, that you'll maybe include certain approaches that will really sort of help you develop your confidence throughout your training programme. It's also going to help you to set targets. So as I've said before, it could be the fact that you are 2 out of 10 for confidence, and perhaps by the end of week 2 you want to maybe be 3 out of 10 for confidence. So it's going to help motivate you and progress throughout your training programme. It is a permanent record, it's a bit of paper, so basically you can always refer back to this. So when you retest throughout your training programme, you can compare the information at a later date to see if you've improved, and if you've not improved, perhaps making the appropriate adaptations to your PDP. It also identifies your strengths and weaknesses, so you can clearly see which ones that you have coloured in the most essentially are your strength, and the ones that you've only coloured in a couple of segments are your weaknesses. It can also be completed anywhere, so this could be completed at home in a quiet space if that gives you the place to reflect. It could be completed essentially in a changing room before you went to play your big game. It can be completed anywhere. In terms of the limitations, you could be dishonest when filling it out. Again, as I have previously mentioned, that could be the fact that you maybe are sitting with a group of friends and you don't want to show that you maybe lack confidence, so you just quickly write something down just because that's what they're doing. You perhaps rush through the process. It doesn't take too long, but you could still rush it if you're not really thinking carefully about your different emotional states. With the performance profiling wheel, it doesn't really tell us why a subfactor is a weakness. We can clearly see from the numbers that confidence is the weakness, but it doesn't tell me what I lack confidence in. Is it before my performance or is it during my performance? It doesn't really tell me that. Again, as I've said before as well, it's difficult to monitor emotions because emotions can go up and down on a day-to-day basis within and out with sport. So the emotional state sitting at home may not be the same as playing in a competitive game. So it could be different out with that context. Again, what I'm going to ask you to do, and this will help you when it comes to analysing questions. Again, you're putting yourself in the teacher's shoes or the coach's shoes, and if you were to lead an athlete through this data collection process, what recommendations or considerations would you provide them with to ensure that they obtain the most accurate information possible? Can I ask you to just now, write on the chat different considerations and start it with "it is important to consider." A number of considerations that I have thought about are completing this test in a quiet space without any distractions. So you've got the time to do that there. You're not worrying about what anyone else is thinking about you. You can fill this questionnaire out in your own time and very honestly. Also, allocating enough time to the process so it avoids rushing. There is a process here as well where you're obviously comparing yourself to a model performer. So are you going through that process thoroughly or are you quickly rushing through that? That ultimately will impact the reliability of your results. The fact that the performance profile wheel should be stored in a safe place or returned to your teacher. Perhaps you're the type of person who puts loads of bits of paper in your bag and it gets lost. So when we ask you to compare it at a later date, you don't have access to it. So perhaps storing it or handing it back to the teacher might be a good idea for you to ensure that when you need to reflect and when you need to compare that information, it is accessible to you and you can make these valid comparisons and measure if you have progressed in your training programme. As I have again said with the POMS test, this is similar. Your personal circumstances when completing the test, your emotions, as I said, can be up and down. So it might just be depending on how you're feeling that day. And again, the fact that you're at home rather than in this sporting context. Lesson 2 is now about applying the command words to the methods of gathering information for the emotional factors. Last week you looked closely at your explain, and this week we'll look at a little bit more at evaluate, and I'll quickly flick through the other ones also. Firstly, describe. So we looked at describe in the previous lesson where you were asked to bullet point the different descriptive points. So you have those answers there. Again, I would encourage you to complete an answer for each method in your own time, because when or if this question was to ever come up, it would be essentially marks in the bag for you, a nice easy describe question. So it's really important that you take your time and you're able to construct an answer. For explain, evaluate and analyse, so your other 3 command words, you're required to follow a certain structure, and within these structures, with all of them, you're required to include an impact. So from your previous unit test, this is where quite a lot of you maybe lost out on marks. It was clear you understood the content knowledge, you knew what all the benefits and limitations were, however you weren't able to provide an impact, which ultimately meant you didn't access the mark. So what I want you to do is just take 7 minutes. So the first 7 minutes required of this video to just really understand what the PARV-M acronym means. For explain, this is the command word Mr. Aubrey looked at last week. So for your explain questions, this is a type of question you could be asked. So explain why you use this method to collect data on the emotional factors. So for 4 marks, I'd be expecting 4 PMIs. So for your point, you'd be asked to basically identify what one of the benefits are. So you refer back to your benefits and limitations table and just pick one. Your meaning, you'd be asked to kind of expand that point, give me a bit of an example, give me a little bit of context to that. And then your impact, how did this allow you to obtain accurate information? Was this practical? Was this measurable? Can you relate this back to PARV-M? And then again, to kind of go that extra mile, did this help you to create a meaningful PDP with appropriate approaches? You can refer back to your slides for the mental factor for sample answers. The key question we're going to look at today, and this is the question that you'll be doing for your assignment this week, is to evaluate how effective this method was in collecting data on the emotional factor. Now, it's totally up to you which one you would like to write about. You can obviously talk about your POMS test and you could talk about your performance profiling wheel. It's completely up to you. For evaluate, you can discuss the benefits and or the limitations for this question. So it's out of 4 marks, so it's up to you if you want to do 2 benefits, 2 limitations. You might do 3 benefits, 1 limitation. You might do 4 benefits. It's completely up to you. Just make sure you're not flipping an answer by saying one thing was good and then saying the same thing wasn't so good. So make sure you're talking about 4 different points. So for your point, I would always start your evaluating this type of question by saying it was effective or it was ineffective, because in that way you're immediately making a judgment there, which is required for you in an evaluate. So that's highlighted in the green. So this would be a qualitative judgment by saying it was effective or it was ineffective. Again, quite similar to your explain, I'm looking for you here to then give me an example, give me a little bit of context to that. And then for your impact, again, relate it back to PARV-M. And did this help you to create a meaningful PDP with appropriate approaches? So again, there you can use judgments by saying it allows you to obtain more reliable information. This increased the reliability of results. This increased the accuracy of results. So I need you throughout to try and include a judgment in there. I have noted an example answer for the POMS test, and I have highlighted different colours to show the PMI structure, and what I've also done is I'm put in bold the judgments that are there as well. So the POMS test was effective as it had quantitative results which was generated by the website. This meant I didn't have to spend time calculating the score from all 65 statements, and I could quickly and easily identify my areas for development. And then your impact, so this resulted in me obtaining more accurate information as there was less room for human error. I then was able to plan a meaningful PDP that included more appropriate approaches. Your assignment that is due this Friday, you're required to answer the following question. So to evaluate how effective this method was in collecting data on the emotional factor. It's up to you if you would like to talk about the POMS test or the performance profiling wheel. I ask that you follow the PMI structure and ensure that you're including judgments. You can refer to benefits and or limitations and refer back to the sample answer from before. Good luck.